thank you very much for joining us today. Western Copper recently announced its newest strategic investor in Mitsubishi Materials. And before we discuss Mitsubishi's involvement, Rio Tinto is also a shareholder. And why don't we just provide a brief background for those viewers who might not be familiar with that deal? When did they get involved and what were the terms of the Rio Tinto deal?
Sure. Well, first of all, Jimmy, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and it's great to be back and chatting with you. But yeah, to kick off, let's maybe just remind everyone, as you said, about the Rio Tinto investment. And the Rio Tinto investment really it started in 2020. Rio signed a confidentiality agreement, did some initial diligence on the project, and they came to us and said, Paul, let's, we like the project, we want to do something, and there was some discussion back and forth, and what we ended up with was what we actually signed, which was this. It's a strategic investment, but every one of these strategic investments has a goal. And so the goal of this Rio Tinto strategic investment was to enable them to do some additional diligence on the project, with the eye that after that diligence, we could talk about, something much more serious, like, maybe them buying the project, and, we'll see. So, we signed the investor rights agreement, and they made that investment, $25.6 million, gives them about 8% of the outstanding shares. We signed that mid-May 2021, so it's about 2 years old at this point in time. And of course, the money was great, but with that came some key rights, and the key rights really are the establishment of a technical committee, which they sit on, and the right to have a board observer, which allows them to make sure that what we're doing at the board level is consistent with what they want to do. But really those rights were around executing a scope of work. And that scope of work, it was, double checking the resource, redoing the metallurgy, lots of stuff on First Nation engagement. We spent, a couple of days going over the tailings facility, et cetera, et cetera. All of that work, all of the technical work is essentially done. It finished really at the end of last year. And so now, the project really is sitting internal within Rio Tinto. I talk to them on a, almost weekly basis, and I'm like, yeah, where are you guys? What's going on? And they're, well, we're dotting I's and crossing T's, and, it's a big company, right? So they're doing lots of analysis of what it all means. But, we've got this deadline of November 28th, where, the current investor rights agreement will expire. So, the idea is that, well before that date comes, that, we need to sit down and talk about what's next. So expect to be doing that here relatively shortly.
So that's a good overview of the Rio Tinto involvement. Now I want to discuss Mitsubishi Materials. Can you provide the backstory on how they got involved?
Yeah, no. And so, the backstory on Rio Tinto, on Mitsubishi, after we signed that deal with Rio Tinto, we went out, we hired some advisors, and we said, very happy to have Rio Tinto here. Are there other groups out there? So last year we signed about 10 confidentiality agreements. We had 6 different groups up to site. One of those groups was Mitsubishi. And, they looked at the project, and, they had publicly come out and said, look, we're looking to invest in copper projects, copper development projects, just not only advanced and operating copper mines, because, of course, Rio Tinto owns and operates a number of copper mines around the world. Mitsubishi does not own or operate any copper mines. However, they are a minority partner in a number of copper mines around the world. And what they're interested in is the offtake, the concentrate, because they have smelters in Japan. So, so they came to site. I'll never forget the site visit, because it was the end of September, and the end of September in the Yukon it can snow at the end of September, although it actually worked out great. We had a really good site visit. Spent about a week up in the Yukon, met with government folk as well. And then they did a very deep diligence. It was quite extensive. We we got lots of questions and back and forth, and then we got really to the end of last year and sort of the same thing. Mitsubishi said, "Look, we love this project. We're excited that Rio Tinto is involved. What's next?" And so we essentially went to them and said, "Well, we're not quite done with Rio here, but we'd be happy to offer you a similar structured deal to what we have with Rio, which is, you come in for, a reasonable, 5 to 10%. We didn't want them to necessarily have more than Rio Tinto. And as a private placement, and then we'll give you investor rights agreement, and we can sort of talk about, some additional work that you want to do." And so that ended up being a $21 million investment, which gives them 5% of the outstanding shares. And with that came in, again, an investor rights agreement. So they're also now on the technical committee. They don't have a board observer, but they have the right of first negotiation on the offtake for the period of the agreement, which in this case is 2 years. So it's until we signed it in March, and so it's valid to March 2025. And then we've agreed to do some work, and most of the work is, unsurprisingly, focused on concentrate quality, and really it's a bit of geometallurgy, just making sure that we've done a lot of work on concentrate quality, but have we really made sure we've tested all the different parts of the deposit? So that's one of the things we're going to look at in some more detail here over the next couple of years with Mitsubishi.
And Paul, you mentioned they came in for 5%. Why would they come in for a higher number, like 19.9%?
Yeah. Well, so there's sort of two sides to this, right? So we didn't want them at 19.9% because we as a public company, but always have to be careful that we don't sort of set up a situation where we can hand control to somebody else. And control is over 19.9%. But if we had Mitsubishi at 19.9% and Rio at 8%, those two could have a pretty short conversation and then suddenly, be in charge of the company and have control. So it's important that we keep, these strategic investments, the sum of the strategic investments, less than that 19.9. I didn't think it was fair to Rio for them to have necessarily more than Rio. So wanted to keep them really below that, essentially 8% that Rio had. But then, they can't come in so low that they have less than other shareholders, since we are, some of our other, funds and that are shareholders. We need them to have a sizable amount in order to essentially justify giving them an investor rights agreement. So, 5%, we sort of floated that out as a reasonable number, and, went back and forth a bit, but, I was settled on pretty quickly.
And so now we're coming up to the drilling season. Does Rio Tinto or Mitsubishi want to do any further drilling? Do they want to do any other testing, any other sort of due diligence in the upcoming season?
Like I said, Rio is essentially from gathering more fresh data. They're not asking me for anything more. With Mitsubishi, we're just kicking off. So, I think we haven't put together the program yet, just in terms of dotting I's and crossing T's, but I anticipate that we'll be doing some drilling to produce MET samples to do, again, just to make sure that we have all aspects of the deposit covered off in terms of concentrate quality and concentrate grade. We'll certainly be doing some drilling that focuses on that this year.
And you mentioned that you signed 10 CAs last year and 6 other groups came to site. Can you still bring in another strategic investor, like another serious mining company?
Yeah, we're having conversations with a number of groups still. It's a great project, right? And in Canada, good economics, good size. We've done good work in terms of developing the relationship with the community and the First Nations and the government. So there continues to be interest, not in addition to the 10 signed last year. I've actually signed 2 this year. So we'll see. It's obviously, at the front of the pack is Rio and Mitsubishi, where we've done their diligence, acknowledge that the project looks very, very promising. entered into that next space that we've talked about. But certainly these other groups are behind them, and at various levels of diligence and analysis as well.
Well, I want to move on now and discuss the feasibility study, which came out in 2022. And one of the features that makes Western Copper and Gold so unique is the gold component and also the moly component and the resulting byproduct credits, which will significantly reduce the cost per pound. Maybe you can just touch on that.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, it's when you look at the value in the ground of this deposit, it runs around 46% copper, 34% gold, and around 17% moly or molybdenum. And I don't talk about moly that much because it's sort of, it's the smallest of the three. But moly is a commodity that when we did the feasibility study, we used $14 a pound, while today it's trading for $33 a pound. So it's getting a little more attention. But yeah, I mean, having those byproducts really impacts the costs in a positive way. And when we look at our projects, it's still primarily a copper project. When we actually look at the cash cost to produce a pound of copper net of byproducts, it's a negative number. I mean, what does that even mean? It's actually, for a project like this, better to look at a co-product basis. And with the co-product basis, it's still $1.54 per pound of copper and, $799, so under $800 per ounce of gold. And so very, very robust operating costs. And, that's over the life of mine. I mean, if you look at this project, it's really two things drive the good economics on the project. One is early high grade. I mean, the grade over the first 4 years is 0.65 percent copper equivalent as opposed to the 0.4 over the life of mine. That significantly drives the economics. And the other one is the strip ratio. I mean, life of mine of 0.43 to 1. I mean, over the first 4 years, less than half of that. I mean, very, very low strip ratio. Now, these are just their innate aspects of the deposit, the strip ratio and the early high grade that, just lends this deposit to be very economically extracted.
And Paul, we should also touch on the net present value and what copper price you're using.
Yeah, I mean, at 360 copper, $1,700 gold, the project puts off a 2.3 billion net present value and 18.1% IRR after tax. And I mean, and importantly for, all of us that live in Canada and know how this works, at an 80-cent dollar. If you put in $4 copper and $2,000 gold and a 74-cent dollar, which is what the dollar was last time I looked at it, you're looking at, net present values of, over 5 billion, mid to high 20s in terms of IRR. And that's also with an updated moly price, which, like I said, doubled. So, good economics at conservative long-term values and just exceptional economics, really, when we look at the snapshot of the commodity price environment we're in today.
You mentioned earlier you're not going to spend much time on exploration this year. You're sitting on $46 million in cash.
Yeah, we're not going to spend much on exploration, and we're sitting on, so we started the year with 23 million in cash, and then we brought in the 21 million from Mitsubishi. And actually, this is an important thing to point out. When we announced the deal with Mitsubishi, Rio Tinto had the right to top up, maintain their ownership, which they did, and that brought in another 2 million. So good from 2 points. One, $2 million, $2 million. Always happy to have a little more money. And also, I mean, it's just further affirmation of the continued interest from Rio Tinto in the project. But yeah, when we look, I mean, this year the focus is really on getting the project into the permitting process. So, it is a pretty heavy lifting year. Actually, we're going to burn through. The work towards permitting is close to about $10 million direct onto the permitting work. And, the goal is to get our application in front of the regulator, in front of YESA, early next year. And so, we really got to push that hard. So that's going to be the big push. We'll have a bit of a field campaign. We're going to do some geotech work. As I said earlier, we're going to do a little bit of work, focusing on getting on the geometallurgy and getting representative samples to look at concentrates as well.
I want to move on now and discuss government involvement. Both the federal government and the Yukon government have made a commitment to constructing a road to the casino project. Can you provide an update on this road?
Sure. Yeah. No, it's, it's an interesting story. I mean, the Prime Minister of Canada even showed up to make the announcement end of 2017. And like all good government announcements, easy to announce, a little bit more difficult to execute. But, flash forward to beginning of last year, and, the government signs a definitive agreement with the impacted First Nations, and that actually grants a construction, awards the construction contract to actually a company with a joint venture with the First Nations. And so it's the first section of the first section. It's the first, I think it's the first 10, 20 kilometers, but it's a $30 million contract. Like, this is, some real money being spent. It's called the Carmacks Bypass, and it's very useful because it allows all the traffic to sort of bypass the town of Carmacks. And so that's under construction. Started last year, should be finishing up this year. So it's, this project would not have gone forward if the casino mine, wasn't a project that had the economics and the support, really, of obviously all those levels of government, but also good support from the First Nations as well.
Paul, the Yukon government has also stated it would like to connect to the grid in northern British Columbia, and doing so would be a game changer for casino in terms of the economics. Can you just touch on this and what it would mean for the casino project?
Yeah, no, and you took the words out of my mouth, Jimmy. I mean, this is an absolute game changer, and it's this is just a really fresh. It's not a fresh idea. I mean, it's certainly been an idea in the Yukon for actually not as many years as you'd think, but certainly over the past few years. But really, it kicked off. There's a new premier that was sworn in January. He's really pushing it, and the timing is now, because if you look at the Yukon right now they just announced last week that they're adding 5 more rental diesel generators. So that brings it up to 22 rental diesel generators because they're running out of power, and they don't have any other options. They just keep renting these diesel generators. So, I mean, the grid itself needs a longer term solution to get green power into the Yukon. So that's point one. And point two is mining's taking off. I mean, we at Casino represent, one of the largest critical minerals projects in Canada. And obviously you're hearing of the federal government, all of these initiatives around, pushing these critical minerals projects. Well, this is an example of pushing it. And then you've got, behind, our projects, a bunch of other, critical mineral projects that are moving forward. So this is nation building. This is, the modern equivalent of the railway and highways and all those sort of things. It's building the grid, and the Yukon grid and the British Columbia grid come within 760 kilometers of each other. So that's the other thing that's happened is, that the Yukon grid has expanded south and the BC grid has expanded north. So it's not sort of crazy distances now. So it's kicking off. There's a lot of excitement about this. There was actually an article on Friday in the Yukon News, which is the local newspaper up there. And there was one, a couple of weeks beforehand. Everybody's pushing for this. It's great for everyone involved. And as you said, it'll be just an absolute game changer for our project. Because, and I don't know what the power costs will be, but it'll be, in BC, industrial power rates are like 4.5 cents, right? So even if it's double that by the time it gets up to our mine, this will still be lower cost power than we're talking. But more importantly, the casino project, our feasibility study talks about 1.2 billion tons of mill reserve, and that's a 27-year mine life. That is 1/3 of the overall known deposit, let alone what else can be found. So we've got a mine up there that has, over 80 years of ore identified. Having that grid connection just absolutely future-proofs it, make sure that the copper and gold and moly and silver coming out of that are, green, and, just establishes a great infrastructure for this mine to operate for, the 80 years of material that's been identified. So we're really excited about it. I mean, I'm, encouraging the government to do whatever they can do to accelerate moving it forward. But it's a great development.
Paul, OEMs have become very aggressive in the lithium sector. General Motors earlier this year made a $650 million investment in Lithium Americas. 2 years ago, you never would have dreamt of an OEM making an investment in an upstream operation like that. And you mentioned earlier that you've signed a dozen CAs here in the past year. And I'm just wondering if you're seeing any interest from OEMs.
Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, none of those dozen CAs were with OEM. And I mean, the other one, which you missed, was Stellantis, the parent company of Dodge, Chrysler, Fiat, made a major investment in McEwen Mining in Argentina as well. So, you are starting to see this actually even in the copper sector. And so it's an exciting development. I think it's an important development. The mining industry is always undercapitalized, particularly at the exploration and development phase. I mean, this is why you have things like flow-through tax credits in Canada, because if you didn't have them, it would be very challenging for exploration companies to attract capital. So, it's this weird disconnect where, these OEMs know they need to have a secure supply of copper and lithium and cobalt. And yet on the other end, you have these, well-established exploration companies with great individuals, or development companies such as ourselves, that, have historically been undercapitalized and are not seeing that capital coming back. So I think you're going to see more and more of it. And excited about that because of the capital side of things, but also excited about that because it will add more weight to, actually getting some of these projects fast-tracked, actually beginning to cut some of the bureaucratic red tape between, discovering a mine, engineering the mine, and then actually all the regulatory process before you're allowed to start construction. So, the federal government saying good things about that. We had the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, talk about fast-tracking critical mineral projects. And so happy to see that. But, I think we as an industry need to keep that pressure on to ensure that there is some discussion about fast-tracking that. And of course, if you bring in car manufacturers and other, heavy industry to also put that pressure on, I think we're going to maybe see something get done.
Paul, as we wrap up, what can investors expect in terms of news flow from Western Copper and Gold in the coming months?
Yeah, so I mean, we'll have a little bit of news on permitting. We'll be announcing the summer program after we've finished meeting with Mitsubishi and Rio and sorted that out. But really, I think the news everyone's looking for is what's next in terms of our agreement with Rio Tinto. It's expiring in November. I will be, as I said, sitting down here hopefully shortly and talking about what's next there. So that's the news that everyone, including myself, is waiting for. And then I'll be honest, I expect to see some good announcements on this grid interconnect, actually, and it'll just be from the Yukon government, pushing that forward. And, as we talked about, that's a game changer for the project and for the territory, and will have a big impact on our project and the economics of the project.
Yeah, with all those CAs, who knows, maybe you'll announce another strategic investor.
Exactly. Those are your words, not mine, but maybe.
Well, Paul, that was a great update, and congratulations on your newest strategic investor in Mitsubishi Materials. And we look forward to our next discussion. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much.